This intended to be a bit of a sequel and an application of the kind of ideas that I was putting forward in previous video on freedom and autonomy in the liberal tradition and in Kant's philosophy in particular, and all the philosophy that emerged from Kantian style ethics, which really went through an amazing revival starting in the 1970s at Harvard, for example, but also like Parfit, I think. And so, I watch that one if you would, uh, and that might make these ideas a little bit clearer. Well, I I guess the origin of these ideas was a semester at the University of Alabama in the early 90s, probably 92, 93, 93, 94. Yeah, the school where George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door. I taught intro to philosophy, I think in the spring. And then in the summer, I taught a class on African American thought. The first such that had ever been taught at the University of Alabama, I believe. I mean, at least in the philosophy department for sure. But, so the African American intellectual tradition, as opposed to maybe even literary tradition and so on. And, I mean, look at me. Am I the kind of person that should be teaching African American thought to a class almost totally of black students, 20 some of them, at the University of Alabama? And isn't it emblematic in some way that it would be a white guy to do that, right? And boy, I had an amazing experience in a lot of ways, though, because there was a student in there, wish I could remember the name, that straight up confronted me, okay, and then had a lot of backing, like, what the fuck are you doing here after a few sessions, okay? And what do you think you know about the African American experience in the U.S.? And we kept going. The power dynamic shifted amazingly, I guess. I tried to make sure it did. I heard that suddenly very dramatically. All right. So intro to philosophy, teaching Descartes' meditations, and then, Du Bois, Malcolm X, slave narratives, Hurston, all these texts in the African American tradition that Baldwin, that I think of as fundamental. And I had a moment. Okay, this is one of the few genuine moments like this that I can describe in my life, where I sat bolt upright in bed in the middle of the night and realized what racism is, or the content specifically of anti-black, although it has wider implications, anti-black racism in Europe and the U.S. This is not to say that this is the motivation for racism exactly. And it's not to say that, for example, the philosophical or intellectual side drove the practical or slave trade colonialism side of racism. Like that, it wasn't the intellectuals who were driving this thing. Okay, it was the bankers, stuff like that. Okay, and the plantation owners and the traders, so on. But the structure of Western metaphysics and epistemology, the kind of thing I was describing in that previous video on freedom and rationality, prov- provides the content of racism in over the last 400 years in the West. All right. So I think, like, I guess I would say, like, the racism is reflected in the philosophy at the most basic level. I'm not talking about philosophers with stray remarks against Africans or something. Like, you can quote Hume and Kant, right? And people do. In a way, that's the least of the problems, and it's the least surprising thing. Uh, it's more that philosophers like Descartes and Kant and Hegel provide an entire intellectual structure for understanding what we're doing as racists or slavers and Jim Crow segregationists, a whole structure for explaining what's valuable and legitimate about this kind of racist situation, right? Without just saying, like, well, we're making a lot of money, so let's just keep going. Like, this is really good for us. No, this somehow anti-black racism reflects the whole structure of the universe and the nature of human beings. And actually, driving racism isn't even necessarily what that's for primarily. It's all about kind of enhancing the self-esteem of European upper class people. But in effect, it is also enhances the disesteem of non-white European, non-European peoples, and justifies their exploitation in the most brutal ways. Okay, so yes, I had this moment where I sat up in bed and realized what racism was. Racism is connected in this way. Its content is given by mind-body dualism. We're minds and your bodies. Now, Descartes, for example, in the meditations goes back and forth about what his mind-body dualism amounts to. All right, so or like, okay, so for example, is each of us a body and a mind? A mind in a body? Are they intrinsically connected in this way that makes them inseparable, inextricable in some ways? He says things like that toward the end. For example, I'm not just in my body like a pilot in a ship, remarks Descartes. Because I can feel stuff in my body and my head and stuff. All right, whatever. The interaction is very complex and difficult to... but the other side of it, and he says stuff like this all the time too, is no, mind and body are completely different kinds of things. And I am, because, for example, the body is extended in space and the mind is not. Though it seems to be located, they're not extended. I mean, and I think one big reason for this is all to argue that the mind, i.e. the spirit, cannot be eradicated. So it's an argument for immortality, which is very important to us, you know. All right, so we are two things all bound up. That's one sort of dualist description. Or we are or we are minds, and we have bodies. We are essentially minds, and contingently, those minds are attached to bodies. And that does seem to be, I think, Descartes' considered position. We are minds, and we're contingently attached to bodies. Now, it doesn't take long, and of course this was true even well before Descartes, or thousands of years before Descartes even, that mind is conceived of as good, as valuable, as the source of truth and light, okay? And body is conceived of as base and animal and the source of evil and temptation. It's not too much to point out that, cultivate your mind and control your body is basic to lots of ethics in the whole West, including Christian ethics, right? We might call this asceticism, for example. I mean, Plato is a dualist, good enough, I say, and you could get a lot of this in Plato. All right, so in a Christian, there's many Christian accounts of the relation of soul to body, but the basic picture seems to be cultivate your soul, release it to God. That's the way you resemble God, is in your spirit, your soul. That's what's valuable about you. Now, portrayed that way, the human condition is a mess because you are a pure soul, but you're trapped in this human body. There's ancient positions, pre-Christian positions that say this just explicitly, like the body is the prison of the soul. Socrates messes with that too. All right, so and then what we seek is release, or whatever. So in my book, these are ideas that developed out of that class and stuff, really, into this book, Act Like You Know, African American Autobiography and White Identity, which came out in '98. It was written quite a bit earlier, actually. The revision process stuff was amazing with Chicago. But anyway, all right. I called racism ejected asceticism, or I might say ejected dualism. So it goes from, oh my God, I am two different kinds of things. A body, which is base, material, and mortal, animal, and a mind that is divine, that's spiritual, that's free, right? And that's good, and that's created in God's image. I don't want to attribute all these ideas to Descartes, but this informs sort of the whole oomph of Western reflection on these matters, emerging from Christianity, I guess. And also from Greek philosophy. Maybe even emerging into Christianity in part from Greek philosophy, because you see this in Augustine, like crazy and stuff like this, and he's definitely got both those things going on. All right. Now, this might disgust you about yourself. That you're a base animal, man, and what you're going to do? Well, it's hopeful that you're spiritual and free and non-physical, too. Amazingly, wildly impossible position, or metaphysics, of course. All right. But anyway, all right, so you might get bummed out that you're a body. Augustine was very bummed out that he was a body. Lots of stuff. Lots of people have been bummed out that they were a body. It makes you mortal. It makes you subject to temptation. It makes you sinful, and so on. But what if I just went this way? We are minds. And they are bodies. What if we made dualism, Cartesian dualism, not a map of the human head, but a map of the world? With its spirit in Europe, among a certain kind of European, and its body in Africa and the Americas, the savage, okay? The bestial savage, as portrayed, for example, in Hobbes, right? But in the whole literature of colonialism and stuff, in the whole period, of 1500 to 2000, whatever, okay. Um, we just use this dualistic metaphysics as a social, a series of social categories. So now, and plus we associate like oppression, like state oppression and statism, with mind, and like statelessness, a la the way they conceived, especially Native Americans, as pure body. These people are, and that means sin, are totally absorbed in sin, and also they're unfree because they're driven by their body. And to be free is to be controlled by your mind, as we've been talking about in an earlier video. Totally controlled by your mind as fixed by external rules and laws. That's what freedom is for Kant. And, okay, right. And that's what savages lack. So I think that, and of course all of this kind of dualistic metaphysics, and then segueing into idealistic metaphysics in Kant, although I think Kant is good enough to say just a screeching dualist on the same level as Descartes, really, except that it's all phenomena. Right? Well, no. I mean, he's a dualist of noumena and phenomena, and then he's a dualist within phenomena as well. I'll try to talk about this a little bit. I mean, his dualisms go... Did I forget my book? Oh my God, I did. No, this can't be true. His dualisms go... it's the phenomenal or the noumenal world, but also it's autonomy and heteronomy. It's it's the world of nature and the world of freedom, and I'm gonna. It's the kingdom of nature versus the kingdom of ends. I mean, all these are dualisms just building up on a basic Cartesian dualism, but also trying to solve some of the intractable problems of Cartesian dualism by this idealist move. The sensible versus the intelligible. I say autonomy versus heteronomy. All right. So what I think is like, a Cartesian dualism is fairly primitive. It just says there's these two kinds of things, and it hints that one of them is real valuable and good and is us and our essence, and the other is base and sucks and is not our essence. And it's definitely not the realm of freedom. This develops into a much more sophisticated structure in Kant. And it's this kind of structure that really, I guess it derives from the structure of colonialism and slavery, I think. And it feeds back into it as well. And this is not to say that Kant also directly, explicitly advocated the slave trade, or racism. These are a little bit controversial, and he did actually, endorse colonialism, etc. Maybe he started to abandon these positions later on in the very liberal way he ended up. But whatever he says, or whatever Descartes says, or whatever any of these people say about colonialism, or however comfortable they are with the slave trade, they have a whole metaphysics that makes it make sense, and that is applicable to it, potentially. It is false, too. That is not enough to show that it's false, that it is a metaphysics that would underpin and justify slavery, but it sure should get you worried about it. I mean, let's just say a few words here. This is all from the groundwork, the fundamental principles of the metaphysics of morals, his basic book in ethics, or one of them, the other being the critique of practical reason, the second critique. It is just this freedom from dependence on interested motives. Freedom from dependence on interested motives, which constitutes the sublimity of a maxim and the worthiness of every rational subject to be a law-making member in the kingdom of ends. For otherwise, he would have to be regarded as subject only to the law of nature, to the law of his own needs. And then he goes on to talk about the kingdom of nature and the kingdom of ends. Rationality is the essence of human freedom. Freedom is the essence of human value. And these are things that animals lack: autonomy, freedom, reason. And they are things that, hence, savages lack. Now, we could think about how to respond to that. So on one account, the savages could be animals or more animalistic than us. And I think, most Europeans believe stuff like that at this time. And so then it might be that, they are naturally suited to slavery because they're not naturally suited to rational autonomy, and hence they don't make any claim to freedom. They cannot be free. An animal cannot be free, because to be free is to be governed by your reason. Again, these are wacky positions. Like, this has so little to do with any sensible account of freedom, I don't even know how to describe it. You're going to be the lawgiver of yourself. Our own will, provided it were to act only under the condition of being able to make universal law by means of its maxims. This ideal will, which can be ours and the proper object of reverence. And the dignity of man consists precisely in its capacity to make universal law, although only on condition of being himself also subject to the law he makes. That is an attempt to beef up, and like I say this about Descartes as well, actually, attempt to beef up European self-image. Okay, like this is buttering up people like Kant, or people he conceives like to be like himself, like saying like, you're rational, so you're free. They're irrational, so they're slavish. Right? You are the greatest thing that God ever made, and a completely unique thing, and you count in a way that nothing else counts, just as Christine Korsgaard or Susan Wolf or John Martin Fisher or Jürgen Habermas continues to argue. And now maybe the way we hear that is like we're valuable in a way that inanimate objects and animals are not. Whatever. These are not maybe the most animal-oriented people. The list of people I just gave. But the way it was heard then, and it still has this hangover, is that we are pure noumenal souls, and they are, and we're free. And we are the lawgivers of ourselves, and that's why we can be the lawgivers to you too, who are irrational, incapable of becoming the lawgivers of yourselves, because bestial. Right? So, mind-body dualism, and Kant has all this kind of slight refinement on it, or disingenuous refinement of it, is the very structure of racism, and its primary purpose is to beef up the self-image of white people, okay, or Europeans, to say, we are minds. I am a pure mind, or whatever. Okay, and in a beautiful refutation of this, believing of yourself that you're a pure mind and the lawgiver of yourself, and that, and hence you need to control and help things like that, Native Americans, Africans, and so on. it's a perfect repression of what you're actually doing, right? Like we're in the slave trade. We are savages, actually. We are here on your coast buying your people and then working them to death or tossing them overboard on the way. We are, and all of that for our economic benefit, so we can eat nice foods and have like beautiful houses and stuff like this. All for our bodies. We are what we said they were. It's the most amazing intellectual piece of intellectual history, where you spend 300 years saying, I'm not, they are. I'm not an animal, they are animals, all right? You know, even if they are literally animals. It's all about constructing the self-image, the self-congratulatory self-image of white people. It's an ego boost. But it's an ego boost with the most practical implications for inflicting suffering on other sorts of beings, or even on this exactly the same sort of beings, like human beings. So I have a pretty darn hostile response to basically to the basic thrust of Western metaphysics from Plato through the Christian periods. We could find some exceptions, interesting exceptions, and definitely infesting modern philosophy, which coincides with slave trade and colonialism temporally, in the most extreme way. And it's in a way that's been in revival. Now, I guess there are other elements too. Like I would point you toward materialism or any kind of monism, right? If dualism is this very structure of racism and colonialism, then monisms of a kind might be a healing. Idealism doesn't work out because it just redeploys mind-body dualism all within the mind or something like this. Like, okay, yeah, but materialism actually is might be a good start on curing some of this. Lucretius, it would be a philosopher that doesn't immediately map onto exploitation, all right? Or Walking Stewart, the 1800s, 1790, 1800, 1810 Lucretian British philosopher. So I guess, it's not that we have to overcome Western metaphysics to overcome exploitation, but we better be real suspicious about that whole history, which continues in definitely emphatic forms. Scanlon, Parfit, the way we do ethics now, dude, the same thing. So I get worried about that.